It was the early hours of June 5, 2022, in the quiet town of Franklin, Kentucky. A street where neighbors usually woke to the sound of birds was instead shaken by panic. The first call to emergency services came just after sunrise. A woman's voice, trembling, told dispatchers she heard shouting next door, loud, sharp, and filled with tension. Then came a sudden, alarming noise that froze her in place. More calls followed, each carrying the same urgency. Something terrible had just happened at the home of 21-year-old Tiara Williams. Tiara was more than a young wife. She was a new mother, a small business owner, and in the eyes of her friends, she had everything going for her. But that morning would prove that what happens inside a home can be very different from what the world sees on the outside. Before we break down every moment of this heartbreaking story, you're watching Wednesday Crime Gist. Make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss the real stories that matter, stories that remind us that danger can hide in plain sight. Just after 6:30 a.m., Franklin police dispatchers were overwhelmed with urgent calls. Some callers spoke in short bursts, their voices shaking. Others could barely get the words out. One neighbor said the shouting had started before sunrise, loud enough to carry through closed windows. It wasn't the kind of argument you could confuse for anything else. And then, after a tense silence, came a sharp, jarring sound that made her heart drop. Officers raced toward the address on Patton Road, Franklin. This was a small neighborhood where everyone knew each other's names. But that morning, the only thing that mattered was getting inside that house. When police stepped through the doorway, they found Tiara Williams lying motionless. Emergency responders rushed in, working as fast as they could, but the harm she had suffered was beyond saving. Right there, in the home she shared with her husband, Tiara's future had been taken away. The man officers were looking for, her husband, Jeremy Williams, was gone. His car was missing. His phone rang without answer. Investigators quickly realized this was not a random act. There was no forced entry, no signs of a break-in. The argument the neighbors heard wasn't between strangers, it was between two people who had once stood at an altar and promised forever. Police knew exactly who they were looking for. And they also knew this search was no longer just about finding someone, it was about finding the person responsible for a devastating loss. What no one realized that morning was that the roots of this tragedy had been growing for a long time, in ways most people never saw. Tiara Williams grew up in Franklin, Kentucky, a small, close-knit community where everyone seemed to know each other's names. She was raised by her mother, Lakeisha, who often spoke about how special Tiara's arrival was.
You fall in love with your children from first movement, flutter in your belly. So I knew already then that I loved her, and giving birth to her and seeing her and holding her just intensified that. It's hard. It's hard not having her here, because not only am I missing a piece of me, but I'm missing that piece that she brought. My daughter had a relationship, not just a mom and daughter relationship, but we were friends.
From the very beginning, Tiara carried a light that seemed to brighten every room she walked into. As a little girl, Tiara was known for her big smile and a spirit that never stayed still. Lakeisha would tell friends how her daughter was always the one dancing in the living room, singing at the top of her lungs, and insisting on helping with anything she could, even if it sometimes meant more mess than help. In high school, Tiara's determination began to shine even brighter. She joined the cheerleading team, became active in her church's praise and worship group, and still kept her grades at the top of her class. Teachers remembered her as bright and dependable, the kind of student who not only achieved for herself but inspired others to try harder too. At just 19 years old, Tiara took a bold step. She opened T&J's Child Care, a daycare that quickly became trusted by families in the area. Friends say it wasn't just a career move, it was her passion. She put her heart into creating a safe, joyful space where children could learn, play, and feel cared for. On social media, Tiara often shared glimpses of her work, the laughter of toddlers, tiny hands gripping crayons, and her own face glowing with pride. Beyond her business, she cherished her family life. Her posts showed sweet moments with her baby daughter, Amiri, and warm, smiling photos alongside her husband, Jeremy Williams. To those watching from the outside, it seemed like Tiara had built a life filled with love, purpose, and promise. But sometimes what we see on the surface doesn't reveal the whole truth. Tiara first met Jeremy Williams when she was still in her teens. In a small town like Franklin, Kentucky, new faces didn't come around often, so Jeremy stood out. He was charming, attentive, and made Tiara feel like she was the center of his world. At first, their relationship was the picture of young love. They went to community events together, shared quiet evenings at home, and seemed inseparable. To anyone looking from the outside, it was the kind of romance people hoped for: easy, exciting, and full of promise. By the time Tiara was 19, the couple had married. It seemed like the natural next step. Jeremy was there when she opened T&J's Child Care, cheering her on as she welcomed the first group of children into her new daycare. In those early days, he seemed proud of her ambition. But over time, something shifted. Friends later recalled small changes in the way Jeremy behaved, questions about where Tiara was going, who she was talking to, and why she needed to spend so much time outside of home. What had started as concern began to feel more like control. As Tiara's business grew and her reputation in the community blossomed, Jeremy's support seemed to fade. His pride in her achievements turned into frustration, even jealousy. Sources close to Tiara said he disliked her speaking with certain people, even if it was about work. Sometimes he would get upset over harmless conversations or friendly interactions. Those closest to her noticed that she was spending less time with friends. She stopped attending some gatherings she once enjoyed. While Tiara didn't share everything, a few people quietly wondered if things at home weren't as perfect as they appeared on social media. The smiles in their photos remained, but the warmth behind them had begun to fade. And on that June morning, Jeremy's obsession reached its breaking point. It was the early hours of June 5, 2022, in Franklin, Kentucky. For most neighbors, it began like any other quiet Sunday morning. But just after sunrise, that peace was interrupted. From the home of Tiara Williams, voices could be heard, raised, tense, and impossible to ignore. Several neighbors later told police they heard an intense argument, the kind that makes you stop and listen. The words grew sharper, carrying out into the street. Then came a sound that froze everyone in place, the unmistakable crack of gunfire. Almost instantly, multiple 911 calls came in. Officers from the Franklin Police Department were dispatched within moments. Patrol cars filled the street, but when they reached Tiara's home, the scene inside was devastating. The 21-year-old had been seriously injured. Emergency responders worked quickly, but her injuries were too severe to overcome. The person police were looking for, her husband, Jeremy Williams, was nowhere in sight. His vehicle was gone, and there was no answer to repeated calls to his phone. A search began immediately. Officers checked roads, homes, and workplaces, while alerts were sent to nearby counties. There was concern he could still be armed, and urgency to locate him grew by the minute. By midday, the search was over. Jeremy was found inside his vehicle on Interstate 65, a short drive from Franklin. Authorities confirmed he had passed away from a self-inflicted injury. Police reports later described the tragedy as a murder-suicide. In just a matter of hours, a young woman's life had ended, her husband was gone, and their 10-month-old daughter, Amiri, had lost both parents. Amiri, far too young to understand, was now in the care of her extended family, her future forever shaped by the events of that morning. For Lakeisha, Tiara's mother, the days after June 5 felt unreal. She had lost her daughter, not to an illness, not to an accident, but to something that happened inside her own home. In her own words to local reporters, she said it felt like losing a part of herself that could never be replaced. A bond between mother and daughter that began at birth was suddenly and violently broken. In the middle of this grief was Amiri, just 10 months old, too young to know the weight of what had happened. She would now grow up in the care of her grandparents, surrounded by family who would tell her stories about the mother she would never remember but who loved her beyond measure. Tiara's daycare, T&J's Child Care, didn't close. Instead, it became part of her legacy. Her family and close friends made sure it continued, because it wasn't just a business, It was Tiara's dream, built with love, patience, and a belief that every child deserved care and kindness. Parents who brought their children there now saw it as a living reminder of the young woman who had poured her heart into it. But behind all of this, the tears, the memories, the efforts to keep her legacy alive, was a truth too many people overlook. Domestic violence is not always loud. It doesn't always leave visible marks. And far too often, it hides behind smiling photos, polite conversations, and locked doors. If you're watching this, remember, you never truly know what someone is going through. A simple check-in, a conversation, or speaking up when something feels wrong could make a difference. If you believe stories like this need to be told, real, honest stories that make people stop and think, then please, like this video. Leave a comment below. What do you think could have been done to prevent this? Subscribe to Wednesday Crime Gist for more powerful stories that matter. Your voice can make a difference. Your share could save a life. And your support keeps these stories alive. Thank you for watching. Stay safe, stay aware, and never ignore the signs.